I'm going to do the Chinese trick of subjecting you to statistics. Chinese GDP growth went from $700 billion US in 1995, our first conference here, to $1.65 trillion US dollars. It more than doubled with an average of 9% growth. For this whole period, China has become the most important manufacturing base for the world. The World Bank estimates that up to 400 million people were lifted out of poverty in China. Its foreign exchange reserves from $75 billion in 1995 to over $600 billion today. And the Chinese have become the largest purchaser of US Treasury certificates, which lowers our interest rates, helps our budget deficit, and contributes to our own economic growth. Trade between China and the designated flashpoint Taiwan in this period has gone from $3 billion to $57 billion in 2005, almost by a factor of 20. A trend which integrates them economically, but at the same time, China has deployed over 800 short-range ballistic missiles opposite Taiwan, and the rhetoric remains sterile and belligerent. The Chinese military budget is more opaque, but by its own statistics, which tell only part of the story, their budget has doubled in 5 years, from $15 billion in 2000 to $30 billion today. Chinese military budget does not, however, cover foreign purchases and paramilitary costs, which have ominous overtones for we in America. Many of the purchases of advanced weaponry from the former Soviet Union, such as cruise missiles, are aimed directly at us. In the meantime, Taiwan's budget has decreased, military budget has decreased from 6% of GDP to just about 3%. The question then comes up, have we become the protectors of Taiwan? What else has changed in this 10-year period? The US had 3 troublesome confrontations with China. In March 1996, the Chinese fired live bullets in an exercise in the Taiwan Strait, and they also fired short-range ballistic missiles north and south of Taiwan. And it was in response to what they considered to be Taiwan's provocations and US compliance. The US sent in 2 carrier battle groups, and the crisis wound down. It was a close call. But it was an indication of the unintended consequences of democracy. You've all read about Hamas in Palestine, or Morales winning in Bolivia. There are unintended consequences in democracy, and we, in fact, contributed to the coming of democracy in Taiwan. We no longer had a comfortable despotic state, but a transparent democracy. Dysfunctional in many ways, but that was it. And what came to power are a group of people who detested China and wanted their independence. And this causes a real political dilemma for the United States. So the surface gong banging and Chinese opera that went on between our aircraft carriers and the Chinese live fire exercises had deep roots in the problems submerging from Taiwan's democracy. Second, the US accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999. It was a terrible thing. It killed 3 Chinese, and large-scale anti-American demonstrations broke out. They attacked our embassy, and it was extremely unpleasant. The degree of hatred that was displayed against the United States, in part sponsored by the party and government in China, manifested itself. Anybody who's been involved in China knows that you throw a match into gasoline when you start playing the anti-foreign card. Well, they played it, and it was very ugly, and it sobered us up. The third incident took place in 2001 when one of our reconnaissance planes, US Navy, crashed into one of their fighter planes, and the Chinese pilot crashed into the sea and died. 24 Americans were held by the Chinese for 11 days and let out. And the plane was sent back to us in pieces. But in any case, I think it reflected a degree of maturity where something could happen between the United States and China where somebody died and it was taken care of. They had an opportunity to keep these 24 hostages. They didn't do it. And there was no violent outbreak of anti-Americanism. A process of maturity seems to have worked itself into the system. But it does concern us because it demonstrates that we have conflicting interests in the Taiwan Strait. And if I can get this pointer to work, you look at this area here, Taiwan, you see the straits here, and you see that as we talk about containment, United States military treaty with South Korea, 25,000 troops, carriers come in, naval ships, F-16 fighter planes. In Japan, we have a very large arrangement with Japan that goes down to Okinawa. We have a Taiwan Relations Act that permits us to defend Taiwan if it's attacked militarily. We have a security treaty with the Philippines, with Thailand. We have carrier facilities in Singapore. We have an arrangement with Australia. And we have bases in Kyrgyzstan. If you look at this from the point of view of Peking, what does it look like? Circle. That's what they think. We say no. The problem is you're projecting power outwards with your newly acquired weapons and your traditional hegemonistic approach to Southeast Asia. They deny it. They say we have friendly relations, but this is at the crux of our difficulty. And when the plane goes down here, our plane goes down, or you have this problem in the Taiwan Strait, or you have the tenseness on the Korean Peninsula at the 38th parallel, you have places where our interests intersect. And it can become a crisis if you don't handle it right. So, as we move on, we sense that the hegemonic outcries of China about the United States' unilateral invention are quite shrill. They support us in Afghanistan because it was a United Nations NATO exercise. They did not support us in Iraq because it was considered unilateral and against their interests in the Middle East policy. So there is a possibility for problems on both sides. China did join the World Trade Organization during this period, and hopefully will become a stakeholder, to use Bob Zoellick's word, in the new economic order. China exports about 40% of its GDP, which means it's very dependent on the world market for its growth and its stability. This is a dramatic change in the autarkic approach that China had in the past. China has become the third largest U.S. trading partner in this period, and the U.S. was China's second. The Chinese trade surplus with the U.S., as you all know, went over $200 billion, while China became, which I imagine some of you don't know, U.S.'s largest growing export market. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai has over 2,000 members, growing at 50 a month, and most claim they're making a profit. American businesses are profiting in China. But on the negative side, there's always the negative side, which our experts will deal with in some depth, but I can just touch on these subjects. China was accused of currency manipulation, massive intellectual property rights violations, CDs, all these things were manufactured and sold at cheap prices by them, costing the U.S. billions of dollars. This happened on my watch in China. It was very tough then, it's even tougher now. Our access to the Chinese market was restricted. There was secrecy in Chinese managing of its commercial matters, dominated by administration fiat and indifference to foreign complaints. Now, if you have a situation where you have a trading difficulty, which can be decided by rational people, you run into a situation in the United States very often that's loaded with posturing and demagoguery. It's not confined to us. They do the same thing. But somehow in here, with our press and our media, it becomes more dramatic. And in the particular instance, you find in the Chinese attempt to take Unocal a shrill screaming about security as the major factor, that they were moving into our energy market at a point when we were energy competitors. It turns out that they pulled out of the deal. I'm not sure that was in the best interest of the United States, that they not buy a company that was in some trouble. But all this is flavored by a good deal of partisan politics. You've heard it in the press, in the TV. And you also probably don't see enough of the other side of the coin of the Chinese economic development, although I think it's beginning to come out thanks to the work of the New York Times, Washington Post. China is dogged by terrible economic and social problems. Its disparities of wealth between coastal areas and inland China, leading to growing peasant dissatisfaction, is apparent and real. The violent demonstrations by China's own statistics surpass 80,000, largely against local governments, corruption, and confiscation of properties. There was large-scale corruption and pollution of the whole water supply and the air supply. Beijing is perfectly terrible in terms of its atmosphere. The downside of economic growth is really serious. As Elizabeth Economy can tell you, 1/3 of their drinking water is polluted. And as in Japan, the construction industry in China has gone mad. The construction industry did a great deal of damage in Japan in terms of the kickbacks that they gave to politicians, the subsidies they got from politicians, and the paving over of Japan in useless building of roads, bridges, all these things, taking away farmland. It caused a real problem in Japan, especially when it was matched with bad financial policies of crony capitalism, loans to the wrong place, relatives getting the money instead of the profit-making company. These issues were discussed by us in China last year in some detail, and the Chinese were fascinated by the Japanese failure. And of course, the shoe fit them too, and they know it does. And how can they restrain this? They need the due diligence. They're beginning to get it, but still, and they're taking action at the central government, but still that eats away at the fabric of society. During this time, in the last 10 years, we're still going over the last 10 years, what's been happening to this place. You got a new leadership at the 16th Party Congress in November of 2002. Younger, better educated, seasoned in the provinces. They were committed communists, of course, with Chinese characteristics. These new leaders were flexible in economic policy, tough on political dissent, and had fashioned a new Chinese consensus, which could become one of the major challenges for the United States in the 21st century. And basically the consensus is you can have free market forces at work as long as you have government controlling major industries, and you can have this free market economy confined basically in a socialist birdcage, a large one. But you've got to keep the element of socialism into the system. That's not unique to China, but they are doing that. At the same time as they have done this so successfully, the other side of the coin is you must have political, authoritarian, single-party control in politics. Pragmatic in commerce, as long as it was clearly in China's interest. China did become more open, there's no question, in their epidemics, whether you name it SARS, HIV/AIDS, or the Asian bird flu. But you know that 20 years ago or 30 years ago when I was in Hong Kong, they could have a cholera epidemic or typhoid, they would never admit it. Now they bring it out because they knew that HIV/AIDS was going to cause them huge problems unless they connected with the international community and worked out means to deal with it. It was a practical decision. but they became, in the process, much more open. And China burst on the world scene in sports and culture. We had a terrific lecture at noontime by the man that wrote the book on Yao Ming. This is one hell of an athlete. He comes here, he knocks you dead. Modest, effective, funny, and 7 feet 6 inches tall. He's a terrific guy. And as he comes out, it exemplifies China in the Olympics, as Brooke pointed out so well, that 2008 is going to be a very big deal. They almost caught us in 2004. We had 35 gold, they had 32. And they want to get those goals as much as they can by having a clean slate, though, on drugs. Yao Ming was great, but it wasn't just him. If you look at one of the best virtuoso piano players in the world, it's Lang Lang. If you look at who is writing the good music in Hollywood, it's Tun Dan. He gets an Academy Award for his music on Crouching Tiger. He's a very handsome, he's written a symphony, which they played in Washington at this October feast of Chinese culture. It was a smash hit all the way through. It was a charm offensive that seized America. It was done skillfully, with excellent musicians, timing, and scheduling. We saw the Shenwei Ballet. It was very innovative and very advanced, and the girls were absolutely lovely. You went into the Shanghai Symphony Orchestra, playing the map, a combination of Chinese folk music and strains of Stravinsky. The people were on there standing up clapping. And then to wrap it up, what do? They play Stars and Stripes Forever. And it was a knockout. The first time I heard Stars and Stripes Forever played that way was in Beijing in 1973, when Eugene Ormandy came over with the Philadelphia Symphony, and they played it along with their Spiggy Pines in Rome, and Madame Mao was demanding Beethoven, and it was a big sort of a cultural mishmash. But when Ormandy plays the Stars and Stripes Forever to us hermits in Peking, it made your hair stand up on your arms. It was incredible. And here this guy from Shanghai does it again. He's got the people on their feet, cheering, clapping. It was quite something. And then they play Tea House, their classic play, in Chinese with subtitles, but it was captivating the way it was done, the staging, the costumes, the acting, superb. And that whole period captured Washington. But perhaps equally important in this period, as the culture bloom comes up, and you see who I think is the most beautiful Chinese girl in the world, or any girl, Zhang Ziyi. See her in 2046, see her in Memoirs of Geisha. I tell you, she is something. And, but perhaps equally important, I'll get away from lovely Chinese ladies for a minute, their MBA programs in Shanghai, 22 of them, full courses, a year to 2 years, tied in with Syracuse, Tulane, all kinds of European universities, booming, turning out smart Chinese for the business world. And you have this other phenomenon that took place in this 10-year period, which is the return of overseas Chinese from the United States to China. And Li Cheng, a historian from Hamilton College, has tracked the movement, and he says, actually, looking at the Chinese educational system, which tells you something about the future of China, probably as many as 50% of the jobs are held by Western-trained students who came back, or teachers, and most of those are American-trained. This doesn't necessarily make them pro-American, but they come back with a different kind of a mindset, a different way to teach than that dreary teaching that they had in China in the 60s and 70s when we were first there. It's a new, vital push in China, and the implications, I think, are uncertain. You know our energy competition is sharpened. It's all over the press. They're going to go up to 10 million barrels a day in a couple of years. They need the oil. They're coming after us. They're going into the Sudan. Darfur doesn't bother them a bit. Venezuela, Nigeria, Kazakhstan, they're moving in. They have no problems with Chavez of Venezuela or Castro. They're heroes. They stood up to the United States. That's all right. But I think I would single out from this period 2 issues and 1 anecdote. That's very Chinese, by the way. 2 issues that I think you should watch in the next couple of days when our experts begin to tell you what they think about what's happening in China with much greater authority and backup than I have. And I would say the first of these issues is what we call our quadrennial defense review from the Defense Department. This comes out, it's a 92-page document, and it's largely focused on China. And you ask the question, is there a threat out there? What does this document say? It expresses concern about the rapid developing nation in China, saying China continues to invest heavily in military, particularly in strategic arsenal and capabilities designed to improve its ability to project power beyond its borders. 1 finding. Number 2, the outside world has little knowledge of Chinese motivations and decision-making or key capabilities supporting its military modernization. And it also pointed out that they're developing disruptive military technologies that could, over time, offset traditional U.S. military advantage. This is us talking to them about what they're doing. And Secretary Rumsfeld has gone over to China and said this directly to them. Or he said in Singapore, too. The Chinese say, the hell with you. We'll tell you what the problem is. It's you. You're the ones that have a military budget 10 times the size of ours. You've got the most advanced military equipment in the world you've got 12, 15 aircraft carriers, we've got 0. You take preemptive unilateral action against your neighbors or people way away from you. You use that military power. And that makes us very, very nervous. You are becoming the great hegemonic future power, superpower. They ain't taking it. They're giving it back to you. And they're saying, you're doing it, you're our problem because our defenses are against you. We aren't aggressive. Ask our neighbors. We're peacefully rising. We're peacefully developing. We're putting money into them. We aren't trying to take over islands or invade countries. So, physician, heal thyself is the answer. That is a serious problem. How this is managed is terribly important, and how we do it is important. I think the second area where you do have this clash of ethics and culture is in the world of, I would say, what you've heard so much recently about Google and Microsoft is the internet, the flow of information. And you've read about the problems we have with our own companies self-censoring themselves or responsive to Chinese demands that lead to the arrest of individuals. This is very distasteful to us. And the Chinese answer is, this is our country, these are our laws, you want to operate here, you follow the law. You don't want to operate here, goodbye. It puts you in a dilemma. But the dilemma goes, I think, much more deeply into the differences the Americans have with the Chinese on 2 issues. One is the flow of information. We tend to feel that it should flow freely, perhaps in some instances too freely. The Chinese always have felt, since the beginning of their dynasties, that information needs to be controlled. You cannot feed information out to people because they can't really handle it. You've got to tell them how to think. And this has been part of the system. It was there when Chiang Kai-shek was there, when Mao was there. It's there today. There's a fundamental difference there on how you handle this. And it goes right back to this issue of the differences between ourselves and China. The second is the role of the individual in society. They tend to feel the individual as part of the collective. This is Confucianism. This is communism. This is the way they see the world. The individual rights are not that important. The collective rights are. Our Constitution is full of the need for individual rights to be protected. They don't see that as important. And this comes up as a human rights problem constantly between ourselves and China. We found it when I was there in 1989 and 90, when we were harboring a dissident, and the Chinese said, in no uncertain terms, he is a criminal, he's carried out counter-revolutionary activities, it's your responsibility to turn him over to us, otherwise you're violating our sovereignty. The individual didn't matter, it was the cause, the state, that mattered. And we worked it out over 13 months with mutual compromise. But we got this thing settled, and we moved on. But it comes up all the time. It comes up in the arrest of Li Da-tong, of this freezing point. It comes up with Catholic priests that are jailed. It comes up with labor disorders. It comes up in many different ways, and these, of course, are blown up, and they're provocative to us. And the Chinese say, what's the big deal? They really felt when we were in Beijing in 1989 at Tiananmen, what's the big deal about bringing law and order and stability to our own country again? If some people die in the process of serving the masses, this has got to be done. And your preoccupation with this and your sheltering of these people is against our interests. So you do have this conflict that comes, that's born out of this information revolution. It's drastically changed the shape of China. And people as intelligent as Tom Friedman and others have said this inevitably leads to the democratization of the society. It hasn't. If you look at what they're doing, they are trying to control it. They've got thousands and thousands of censors. They're getting into websites. They're nailing people. They've got collusion from foreign companies. They're working against it. And they've also, interestingly enough, got the Chinese themselves dealing with this rather nonchalantly. Their business people, their successful people, are not really turned off by arrest of these people that are saying these things on the internet. They want stability too. And the effect of the Chinese propaganda in reaching broad reaches of the society are very powerful. So this puts us in another dilemma with China because it's going to go on and on and on. I don't think it's anything that should be make or break, but it's a constant irritant in the relationship born of deep differences about how you deal with your information distribution. And by the way, I would recommend, if you want to follow this through, read a book called Treason by the Book by Jonathan Spence about how the Chinese root out dissidents, crime think, effectively, ruthlessly, and continuously. So this is a problem for us. It's going to be there. It's going to be there when we're gone. Now comes the anecdote. I try to leave you with an image that captures some of what I've been trying to say. And we play with images because images are part of China, whether it's the cranes in Shanghai or the circular roads in Peking or what's happened in central China, in my old town of Qiuqiang. It's incredible what they've done in roads and building and that. But when our policy man on state went over to China last fall, he made a comment which I'll pass on to you. He said, here we were in the Diaoyutai guest house. This is in northwest Beijing, great villas, trees, moats. It's where Henry Kissinger went. It's where Chirac went, Putin goes there. It's the high-level meeting. It's big face. And he said, in that first villa, there was Bob Zoellick, our very talented, smart economic czar and our leading man on China policy. And he was dealing with the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Dai Bingguo, who was the number two, who was also sophisticated and intelligent. The exchange was not tranquil. We've got problems with him in the economy, real problems. But it was done by people with good sense. And the Chinese demonstrated a great knowledge of international law, the requirements of the World Trade Organization, the kinds of sanctions that can be taken if they violate certain areas, the currency manipulation issue, the intellectual property rights issue, the market access issue. These two men talked about it in very worldly terms. It made you feel good about our relationship with China. Not that you're going to see good results necessarily, but it was two very civilized men dealing in a very intelligent way with common international problems. In the second villa, we had our 640 talks on North Korea going. And there the Chinese were chairing it. We had Japan, US, Russia, South Korea, China, and North Korea, all there. The Chinese had all of these scorpions in one bottle. And they were sitting there mastering the thing with concessions, agreements, midnight sessions, talking to these awful North Koreans who would be drunk after 10 o'clock every night. It was hard to talk to them. But you could get them out when they sobered up and get them to begin to agree to certain things. And it was a master performance by them. They weren't going along with the United States. They aren't going to go along with us. But we've got common objectives. If you look at the Korean situation, it is dangerous. We were there, Andy and I were there in 51, 52. And we saw what happened to South Korea, the terrible devastation, and what we did to the North in bombing. But what the Chinese want in North Korea is what they don't want. Because here is this terrible state of 23 million people living in a Stalinist era at its worst. Huge gulags, a strident propaganda that's the most disagreeable propaganda you've heard, and a failed economy. They can't produce bubble gum, but they can produce missiles. Here you have this country with this man, and the Chinese look at it, and they know it, and they've said to me very clearly, don't you lecture us on North Korea. We know them a hell of a lot better than you do. We've been at them since 1945. And they say, they don't say this, but you know what they're doing in North Korea. It is basically, they don't want the place to collapse. And they've got to prop it up, distasteful as that is. Why? Because they don't want 5 million refugees from this miserable country going into Manchuria, which is one of the most backward areas of China. Huge factories, unemployed workers, violence. All they need is 4 million hard-eyed kimchi-eating Koreans, and they're in real trouble. So the best thing to do is to feed them in Korea and don't feed them in Manchuria. The second point is they say, look at these generals with medals from their throat down to their groin, their stone faces. One of these guys, totally indoctrinated in the cult of personality and the hatred of the United States, if the place implodes, this guy gets his hands on the nukes. And Kim Jong-il may be difficult, but if you get some mad warlord up there with nukes, then you got a real problem. The third, and perhaps the most distasteful of all, is if the United States comes in. We are in Seoul, we have a treaty. What happens if this place collapses and Seoul takes it over? Then you get a unified Korea under Seoul, allied to the United States with American troops on the Yalu River that separates North Korea. That's why they fought us in 1950 and drove us back to the 30th parallel. They don't want that to happen. They're working it in their own way by building up their power in South Korea and their influence. But this is a very unattractive alternative. So the best thing to do for the time being is to prop up these miserable North Koreans and let them keep their bloody nukes. But we want them to get rid of them because that's not good for anybody. But if there's a choice between having them survive and using the nukes, survival is more important. In our case, we want to get those nuclear weapons out. We don't want these people with a horrible track record in North Korea of violence and support of terrorism and their hatred, their connection with certain terrorist organizations. We don't want them to have the nukes. We think it's a real danger to the United States. We also think it's a danger to us and to China and to South Korea that they're using their sale of narcotics and counterfeit money to supply their government with funds, $500 million a year, people estimate. So we want to stop their illicit trade. We want to stop them from getting nukes and proliferating them to the bad people who will use them against us in New York or Washington, wherever it is. The South Koreans say simply, economic seduction. It happens. It can happen in North Korea. We're doing it. They're difficult. They're tough. But we're moving in. We're linking up the infrastructure. We're setting up the Kaesong Industrial Zone. We're going to have a joint team at the Olympics. All these things. Let us do it. They're our brothers, our blood brothers. Let us do it. And there is some wisdom to what they're doing and what the Chinese are doing and what we're doing. The real trick is to get some sort of a program going where you get at the weapons of mass destruction and use your economic leverage. It seems obvious, but it is very tough to do, given the different objectives that both South Korea and China have. And what's in the third villa? Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, one of the most brutal dictators in Africa. And if he wasn't there, it was Karimov of Uzbekistan, who just gunned down 1,000 of his people to stay in power. And the Chinese pin a great big medal on his chest, and Hu Jintao, their president, walks with him almost hand in hand before the honor guard. And if it wasn't these guys, it would be Pol Pot, one of their favorites in Cambodia, the genocidal maniac of the 70s, or Milosevic. They thought he was great. Hoxha of Albania, you name it. There is something in the character there that leaves you with these contradictions. You can't explain them, but you know that as you go into China and as you see the sophisticated level of exchange you have on international strategic issues or on international economic issues, there's this other thing over here, this link to the third world that started with their support for violent revolutions in the 50s after World War II. Tapered down, they became much more civilized, but still there is this connection to very, very distasteful and harmful people. I leave you with that dilemma. I can't solve it. I can say, since my instructions were to deal with Taiwan too, perhaps, that in this area in Taiwan, which is a state of Han Chinese, most of them here right in Taiwan, again, about 20 million people, a going democracy, maybe not one to our liking all the time, but that's democracy, and a successful economy, and a friend. The issue comes up, what do we do about it? Can it unify with China? Can it become independent, or can it stay the status quo? The easy thing is to say status quo. But there are three dimensions of this, which I'd just like to mention briefly. First, you have the rhetorical exchanges, and this is where the Chinese prevail, because they've got 50,000 propagandists writing this stuff every day. It's like getting into a watering contest with an elephant to take them on rhetoric. Billions of words of history, a fascination with the word, written and spoken. And rhetorically, they can make the logical case. These are Han Chinese. Hong Kong is reunited with us. Macau is reunited with us. It's been reasonably successful. Hong Kong, according to Heritage, is the freest economy in the world, 10 years after it reunified with China. Why can't Taiwan do it? You Americans have said you recognize us as the only legal government of China, and you recognize that Taiwan is part of that China. Well, we never did, but it was said in some secret conversations that they've taken and got memories like elephants that remember these things. So they say, you are interfering in our internal affairs by selling arms to a dissident group that use them against us. And we can say we support democracy, freedom, and non-use of force. Oh yeah, Chinese say? Really? Yes, we do, in Taiwan. So keep your cotton-picking hands off of Taiwan. So you've got this situation in Taiwan. Rhetorically, they've got the leg up. If you go into the strategy of Taiwan, you realize that for 500 years, Taiwan has always been dominated or influenced by foreigners, whether it's the Portuguese or the Dutch or the English or the Japanese or us. And it's always been a launching pad into China, whether it's pirates in the Taiwan Strait or the Japanese invasion in '37, or the American paramilitary activities against China after 1950 were directed from Taiwan by a huge paramilitary operation that failed utterly, but left them with a long-standing suspicion of American motives using Taiwan as a launching pad. So, as a launching pad against China, it figures. And also it would be very nice for them to have Taiwan in their control. It outflanks Japan, outflanks the Philippines, and opens the whole Pacific Ocean to them. A country that just makes their naval their first priority. So you have a situation where in that area, they have the historic problem, but we have the power. We have the fleet, we have the Navy, we have the Air Force, the missiles, that make it very difficult for them to expand their perimeters using force. The deterrence of the United States is overwhelming. So geostrategically, despite their historic past and despite their ambitions, the United States has got the overwhelming power to keep them from adventurous militarism. The third, of course, which is very disturbing to me, is that nobody that I know of in Washington has a real feel, and I think our experts can perhaps enlighten you on this tomorrow, of the enormous dynamic economic relationship between Taiwan and China. It's absolutely huge. It's tied in with globalization. It runs from Silicon Valley into Hsinchu and Taipei up to northwest Beijing. It's incredible and involves venture capital from Korea, Japan, California, New York, going into these huge research and development centers in China, moving from Silicon Valley over to China with Taiwan legal and financial support. It's a huge force that's going on. And the implications are not understood because the leaders of Taiwan talk to the leaders of China, business leaders, I should say, in Taiwan, talk to the political leaders in China regularly. What do they talk about? Do they talk about tariffs, voting rights, that sort of thing? They're obviously talking about other things. And you see an emergent integration between the two sides, which is encouraging. It doesn't rule out war. It makes it much less likely. So in these two so-called flashpoints, you have differences, you have complex problems. The United States is right in the middle of both of them, and I don't think we can extricate ourselves. But as I say, and as my wife says wisely about China, if you can't handle contradictions, get the hell out of China. Thank you.